The genesis of the piece was that he's got a new film coming out in December called Youth Without Youth, and it's the first film he's made in 10 years. Very kind of challenging and personal film, and it's kind of a throwback to the films he was making in the 70s, the era of Apocalypse Now and the Godfather films and The Conversation. He actually used the metaphor of prostitution. He sort of called himself a prostitute on some of the films he made in the 80s and 90s. Very charmingly, he said it was always important to him, if he was going to be a prostitute, he at least had to find something to fall in love with the John, if you're sort of extrapolating the metaphor a little bit more than he did, or the film. So what happened was that he had founded a movie studio in the early 80s, American Zoetrope, and he had actually bought a property in Hollywood a lot, and he made his first film there, One from the Heart, this experimental musical he did that came out in 1982, and it was a big flop, and the studio had all kinds of overhead, and it ended up being a big financial disaster for him, and he ended up with a $25 million personal debt hanging on his head. So basically, what he was doing in the 80s and 90s was taking jobs for hire just to sort of work his way out of debt. What's interesting about Youth Without Youth is that Coppola financed it almost entirely himself, and where he got the money from is from his wine company, which is now the 12th biggest wine producer in the country by volume. So he's making a lot of money off that, and it's interesting because this is a guy who has spent almost his whole career trying to gain independence from Hollywood, and he started this wine company back in the 70s, kind of modestly, almost for fun, and it's sort of slowly grown over the years, and it's finally developed into a big enough business that he can, that he's now a truly independent filmmaker. It was funny when Coppola was talking about watching The Godfather, because he said it was a film he always hated because the experience of it had been so miserable for him that he had never enjoyed watching it. And I think it had been long enough since he'd last seen it that he was saying he felt he could get a little more objectivity, and he was impressed with it. I mean, he said he said he liked it. I think what impressed me most about Coppola is you have to look at this guy who's been kind of banging his head against the studio system for so long, and trying to make these ambitious movies, and sometimes succeeding, and sometimes failing. And I think he's a guy who probably could have been broken a lot of times along the way in his career, and yet he's always sort of kept fighting and kept trying to do things on his terms, and finally, and at an age 68, where he's kind of in the later part of his life, I think he's finally succeeded.